At Russia's request, the UN Security Council convened an emergency meeting Thursday. Russia wanted to respond to the UK's assertion that they were involved in a nerve agent attack against a former Russian spy and his daughter living in England. We'll hear from representatives of Russia and the UK. This is just under an hour.
I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the 14th of March, the Security Council held an open debate on the letter of the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Theresa May. That letter contains horrific and unsubstantiated accusations against Russia in the use of chemical weapons on the territory of the United Kingdom. The representative of the United Kingdom promised us at the time to brief the Security Council on the course of the investigation regularly. However, we didn't have any such briefings. So, being as it may, we will brief you in detail. So, it has been a month since, in the British city of Salisbury, the Russian citizen Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were found unconscious. Now, the use of chemical weapons, if this did indeed take place, is a threat to non-proliferation, and as such it is a topic that deserves to be considered by the Security Council, especially since we do have quite a bit to say and we do have some questions to ask our British colleagues. So what do we know about the crime and its victims? Sergei Skripal, who was convicted in 2006 for spying for Great Britain, after being amnestied in 2010, lived in the United Kingdom while maintaining his Russian citizenship. Periodically, his daughter Yulia, citizen of Russia, visited him. According to the version spread by the British side, Russia did not forgive him his treason and decided to eliminate him. Now, given that there was no threat that this individual represented for Russia, that is obvious. So a number of questions begs to be asked. First of all, if we speak very cynically, why did we have to wait 8 years and decided to do this 2 weeks before the presidential elections in Russia and just a few weeks before the World Cup? Why was he even released from the country? Why eliminate the individual through this strange and dangerous for people around him and such a highly public method? Everyone who knows crime novels, or for example, the Midsummer Murders, which is a well-known British series, they all know hundreds of very clever ways of killing someone. However, those who sought to kill Sergei Skripal and his daughter supposedly chose an extremely toxic chemical substance, so the most risky and dangerous method possible. At the same time, they didn't really finish the job because the two individuals seem to be alive, and Yulia, thank God, seems to be improving rapidly. So in this very complex case, there are lots of questions. And the further we go, the more questions keep cropping up. From the very beginning, the British side, represented by such expert chemists as Prime Minister Theresa May and Minister of Foreign Affairs Boris Johnson, unequivocally stated that in the case with the Skripals, the substance used was so-called Novichok, and that it is highly likely that this substance comes from Russia. Now, if this very powerful substance was spread in the house of Skripal or on the doorknob of his house, and that seems to be the version that the investigation seems to be pointing to, how could Sergei and Yulia have remained in normal state a few hours following that? Given that the Sergeant of Police, Nick Bailey, the first individual who helped them, immediately lost his consciousness. were they able to survive after all this? The only, in substance, explanation is that an antidote was immediately introduced into them. Immediately. Now, to do this, according to the unanimous view of experts, the sample of an exact same substance, not a similar substance, but the exact identical substance, had to be present somewhere nearby. Several kilometers from the scene of the crime, a British research center, Porton Down, is located, which is well known for its development of chemical weapons. Now, there are a lot of questions that we have about the activity of this center. However, this is what's interesting. Gary Aitkenhead, head of the laboratory in Porton Down, stated on Tuesday that his laboratory has determined that this was a toxic nerve substance, but it could not confirm its origin. That was a quote. Furthermore, he said that no antidotes were introduced into the Skripals. He assumed that the British government, unlike him, may have additional information on this topic. Now, we have to pay tribute to Mr. Aitkenhead. He did not put in danger his professional reputation to service the guesswork or the versions put forward by the British authorities. At the same time, he assured everyone that nothing of the kind, no substance of the kind, could have left the premises of his laboratory. So the question is, what was this that couldn't leave the premises of the laboratory? And does the OPCW know about this substance? Now, no matter what happens, all this means that the main argument of the British side about the unquestionable Russian origin of the substance has basically is no longer valid. Now, all the system of evidence about the highly likely version of the involvement of Russia was based on that premise. But that statement by Mr. Aitkenhead only adds even more questions into this case that is before us. Once again, we want to state urbi et orbi. Novichok is not copyrighted by Russia, in spite of the obviously Russian name. It is a name that was invented in the West for a line of toxic substances, which is nothing new for experts and scientists, were developed in many countries, including in the United States and in Great Britain. Boris Johnson, in response to a direct question of Deutsche Welle, directly confirmed that Great Britain does have samples of that substance in Porton Down. Yesterday, on the site of British Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the tweet about the Russian origin of the substance was deleted. This already led to some scandals and some serious talk behind the scenes. However, Boris Johnson and the British Foreign Service immediately got extra support and assistance from the British Special Services, just like Chippendale, which through using the Times newspaper yesterday stated that they were able to, on the basis of a scientific analysis and intelligence data, determine the probable origin of the substance already a few days after the chemical attack in Salisbury. It is stated that on the 7th of March, the Cabinet of Ministers knew that the chemical substance was produced in Russia with a very high degree of probability. Now, the British Intelligence Service consider that they have determined the location of a secret Russian laboratory where the nerve agent was produced. And furthermore, be very attentive to what I'm about to say, the sources of the British intelligence services cannot speak openly about the location of the laboratory. However, their knowledge of where it's located, their certainty of where it's located is very high, their degree of certainty. They also consider that the Russian side conducted tests to determine whether Novichok could be used for politically motivated murders or assassinations. There's even more. The Daily Mail also yesterday revealed that British intelligence services have highly secret information from certain sources about the fact that Russia, it turns out, just before the attack in Salisbury, tested the nerve agent Novichok on everyday targets, or like a door handle, for example, or everyday objects. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I don't even know what to say about this. It's some sort of theater of the absurd. Couldn't you come up with a better fake story? I mean, we all know what the worth of British intelligence information is based on the experience with Tony Blair. We have told our British colleagues that you're playing with fire and you'll be sorry. Because it's one thing to put forward unsubstantiated accusations, and it's quite different to start speaking using professional terms, which means not simply who will speak loudest in diplomacy, but it requires clear answers to very specific, substantial questions. I don't think that the British investigative bodies are grateful to the British government for their hasty and unequivocal statements and conclusions. All this, of course, your politicians never thought about all this, did they? They had no idea that their hyped up statements might boomerang and hit them. They used a very useful and timely anti-Russian canard. The topic, Russian chemical attack, so-called. Of course, they weren't aware that once the dust settles, they will be held responsible for their words. And yet London started poisoning our relations with other countries as a sign of solidarity. Out of a number of states that are allies of the United Kingdom, some 150 Russian diplomats were expelled. We know that your ambassadors around the world are putting pressure on sovereign states and are forcing them to follow this very terrible example. You started a wave that even reached New York. Your allies in the United States have undertaken an unprecedented expulsion of 60 Russian diplomats, including 12 staff members of the permanent mission of Russia with the UN, without providing any proof for this, without conducting consultations with us as provided for in the agreement on headquarters, presence at headquarters, and hence they clearly didn't comply with all the provisions of the headquarters agreement of the United Nations and lived up to their obligations. And by the way, it's not the first time that the United States has not lived up to their obligations in this area. Now, also, the United States forced Russia to give up its diplomatic property. The United States forced Russia to give up its diplomatic property. The United States seized from Russia diplomatic property that belonged to it, including Russian property here in the permanent mission at the United Nations in New York. They established a 25-mile zone for our diplomats, a restricted zone. They're not extending and they're not issuing them American visas. We call on the United States to be responsible vis-a-vis their responsibilities as a host country and to return everything that they illegitimately took from us. and refrain from similar steps in the future. Mr. President, we are witnessing truly remarkable events. This new approach in law, I already mentioned this, where you have accusations based on simply without any proof. I already mentioned this at the meeting of the 14th of March, simply on the basis of suspicions. However, no less surprising is something else. When I look at the debates, interviews, and statements of British politicians, I'm simply stunned. O tempora o mores. What happened to good old England? Is this a lack of professionalism or a deterioration of political culture? Or is this exactly the kind of new political culture we're seeing? I really don't have an answer. I perhaps will allow those present here to draw their own conclusions. The British authorities are trying to almost make fun of Russia by providing some 30 versions of what has happened. Now, you should note that these are not versions of the Russian provided by the Russian authority. These are opinions by experts and journalists. It's true that there are many versions because there's not enough facts or evidence. Whereas in Russia, everyone here wants to get to the bottom of this dark story. But the British authorities, in fact, don't have a lot of versions. Or rather, they have just one version, and which they have put forward as a verdict at a trial. And at the same time, they can't determine, they can't come to grips, they can't determine what the source of the toxic substance is. Is it the house of Mr. Skripal, the doorknob? Is it flowers, buckwheat grain, or laurel? Now, we have to acknowledge that the citizens and experts from Great Britain and from other countries, those who are capable of thinking, also have come up with a whole range of different versions. And there are many questions to which they don't have answers. Here are just a few of the questions. Where were the Skripals for 4 hours with their telephones switched off? How were the samples taken? Who can confirm their reliability? Why weren't relatives asked for their approval to take blood samples? How did the antidote against an unknown chemical substance appear so quickly? And was it injected into the Skripals? What was Skripal doing? Who was he communicating with? Where did he go? Where was he traveling? Who was he talking to? Did they meet with anyone on the day of the event, or on the eve, or the day before? Where's the data from the video surveillance cameras? Now, how are these accusations put forward in haste? How do they correspond, or how do they gel with the statements by the Scotland Yard that they will require several weeks or maybe months of investigative work? Why is Russia not being given consular access to Russian citizens against whom on the territory of Great Britain possibly a terrorist act was carried out? The British authorities decided quickly that their insinuations without evidence will not cost them at all. Believe me, my friends, this story and this investigation is far from being over. In fact, it hasn't even begun. On the 12th of March, we sent to the Foreign Office a note with a request to provide us access to the data from the investigation, including the samples of the chemical substance that the British investigation was referring to, for our experts to examine it in the framework of a joint investigation. This way, we were acting in the framework of Article 2 of Paragraph 2 of Article 9 of the Convention on Chemical Weapons. According to that convention, member states can, on the basis of an exchange of information and consultations on a bilateral basis, resolve any issue that could cause any doubts regarding the compliance with this treaty. Now, based on the provisions of that article, Russia would be ready to respond to a request by Great Britain within 10 days. Instead of all this, London put forward a completely absurd 24-hour ultimatum. Obviously, we rejected it. No one and under no circumstances can talk in this way or using this tone with Russia. And this ultimatum, which was transmitted to Boris Johnson orally to the Russian ambassador in London, the Foreign Secretary made clear
that there are only two possible scenarios. Either the Russian state has attempted murder on the British soil using a chemical weapon, or Russia lost control of its stockpile of nerve agents. The Foreign Secretary asked the Russian ambassador to explain which of the two possibilities was true and to account for how this Russian-produced nerve agent could have been deployed in Salisbury.
24 hours we were given. That is the whole range of questions that the British side put to us. There were no other questions. So, looking from it based on today and based on the additional information and statements we've had since then, the questions in that ultimatum seem even more absurd. On the 14th of March, Mrs. May sent to the Director General of the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW, Mr. Uzumju, the proposal to conduct an independent analysis of the results of the British investigation of the incident in Salisbury. At the same time, our British colleagues forget that by acting in the framework of the OPCW, which we believe is the only correct way, they not only have rights, but they also have certain obligations, including obligations towards us as fully fledged members of the organization. And we have clearly reminded them of that during the special meeting of the Executive Council of the OPCW that was convened yesterday at our request. We proposed a draft decision on a joint investigation. It was blocked by the United Kingdom and its allies, which they immediately considered as a victory, although the number of those voting for and abstained, in fact, exceeded the number of those that voted against. And this is quite understandable. Why does Great Britain need a joint investigation if they've already established who's guilty before even beginning the investigation? And this kinds of investigation might destroy their clear version based on such powerful arguments and words as highly likely, overwhelmingly likely, highly plausible. There's almost no doubt. There's no other plausible explanation. Russia was almost certainly to blame. High likelihood of Russian responsibility. Russia is the likely perpetrator. Boris Johnson continues to convince everyone that the British side supposedly sent Russia a list of questions to which it still hasn't received any answers. And everything, in fact, is completely the opposite. As I said, we never received any list of questions. And I turn to the British side. If you have such a list of questions, please tell us. Please list those questions. But please don't consider accusations in the form of an ultimatum and demand to acknowledge and to own up to being guilty as a list of questions. We, on the other hand, do have a lot of questions, both to London, to the OPCW, and also to France, which all of a sudden, for no reason, based on what provisions of the convention, immediately rushed to assist the British side in confirming the results of the British so-called express investigation. In response to our request, the French side stated that Great Britain provided detailed information to France about its investigation. Well, since London refuses to provide us information, maybe Paris could share that information with us. Today we have circulated a note that you could take a look at. We also will circulate a number of comments of the official representative of the Foreign Ministry of Russia that contain some very interesting information. I think it will be very interesting for you to get acquainted with it. And we will provide this statement with a translation to you as well. Mr. President, a level of intellectual justification of the accusations put forward against Russia is absurd. It's impossible to even smile when reading this. Boris Johnson, who constantly claims that he's a Russophile, stated something absurd, and this is the nicest word that I can use, really. Absolutely absurd and immoral premise that the incident was was necessary for Moscow to bring people together just before the elections. Just as immoral is his comparison of the Russian World Cup with the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936, which, unlike the Soviet Union, unlike the Soviet Union, had a very large delegation from Great Britain, including with dignitaries present there. Boris Johnson referred to the novel of Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, where the whole intrigue supposedly is whether the criminal will confess by himself or whether he'll be caught. Well, the novel is not really about that. It's not a crime novel, as the British minister thinks, but rather a deep philosophical work of literature. By the way, we've already mentioned the British proverb from the novel about 100 rabbits that will never become a horse, no matter how much you try. And I would suggest that Mr. Johnson perhaps read some other novels by Dostoevsky, or at least get to know their names. And I'm not going to give you a list of those names of those novels. Now, as a so-called argumented evidence of the guilt of Russia, the British ambassador in Moscow demonstrated to his colleagues this 6-page slideshow, including the title page. These comics are provided in lieu of evidence, and once again they contain nothing but statements like highly likely, and it can be, and we can imagine that this slam dunk document was provided by Mrs. May to her European Union colleagues, many of whom, unfortunately not all, took this as evidence against Russia, as reliable evidence against Russia. Look at this. It's an absolute travesty. We'll circulate this to you. The polemics about these 6 pages. I mean, it's an insult to your intelligence. What sort of lack of respect do you have for people who you're trying to convince using this as evidence, and those who you are supposedly trying to convince, don't they understand that they're simply the targets of this kind of manipulation, and they're taking part in a collective psychosis? Now, the statements by Boris Johnson about the dead cat on the table, that simply is a way of distracting from other maneuvers. If you want, you can listen to his interview if you want to know exactly what he was saying. These are excellent examples of the propaganda war that is being waged without any rules, without respect for rules. The kind of propaganda war that is being waged against Russia. And by the way, since I mentioned dead cats, in the house of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, which supposedly was contaminated, according to his words of his niece Victoria, there were 2 cats and 2 guinea pigs. Where are they now? What happened to these animals? Why doesn't anyone mention them? I mean, their condition is also an important piece of evidence. Mr. President, we live at a time of a collective loss of intellectual clarity. What kind of psychotropic substances are used to manipulate the public? I don't know, except for one substance, or means rather, and that is the media. This is the terrible weapon of our times. Using the media, it's easy to manipulate human consciousness. And we're witnessing how the Western media is very successful at doing this. At the same time, you don't need any kind of very highly intellectually sophisticated methods. It's enough to regularly and keep repeating the same lies without any evidence, and to until people start to believe it. This is all using the method of Dr. Goebbels. Lies that are repeated 1,000 times become the truth. We will demand answers from you to the questions we have put, and if you don't provide answers, if you don't agree to answers, we will then consider this as evidence of slander which you have used against us. We will seek to obtain fully fledged cooperation from you regarding the case of the Skripals. If you refuse, we will consider this as an attempt to conceal the truth. Mr. President, everything that is taking place, I think, confirms to us that what was clear from the very beginning, and that is that this is a coordinated, very well prepared campaign in advance, prepared in advance. It's not by chance. The main goal is clear. It is to discredit and even delegitimize Russia, to accuse it of the use of a horrible, inhumane weapon, in concealing arsenals of this substance, of being in breach of the Convention on Chemical Weapons, to put in question its role not only in finding a solution to Syria, but anywhere else. The idea is to put in question the political legitimacy of Russia in principle. At the same time, to discredit our position on the Syrian chemical dossier. So, basically, the idea is to kill two birds with one stone. Now, since the British authorities dare to state that behind the incident in Salisbury, it's Russia's responsibility with a high degree of probability. Well, we also, with a high degree of probability, are assuming that the intelligence services of certain countries are behind this mega provocation. Russia, which has no connection to the poisoning of the Skripals, is more than anyone interested in determining the truth. We will work hard towards establishing the truth based on the provisions of the Chemical Convention. If the British side will continue to use suspicions and claim that these are evidence, if it will continue to base itself on assumptions rather than facts, this will only confirm our assumption, which is quite likely, more than likely, and that is that all this very questionable case is a fabrication, or rather, the worst form of provocation. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. We see the only way of obtaining an objective truth by strictly complying with the mechanisms of the Chemical Weapons Convention and cooperate in an investigation. We also await answers to the very clear questions from the British criminal investigation. We demand consular access to Yulia Skripal. So, summing up, this is what the situation is. The origin of the substance in Russia is not confirmed. Even before that, we stated that we had nothing to do with it. However, we seem to be, people are demanding that we acknowledge our guilt. Now, Great Britain refuses to cooperate with us on the pretext that the victim cannot cooperate with the criminal. Well, I'm really sorry. Your appointment of us as a criminal, without facts, without evidence, without a trial or investigation, are null and void. Meanwhile, a crime was committed on British territory, and possibly a terrorist act against our citizens. And they happen to be the victims. This is why we are entitled to demand cooperation, and Great Britain is required to offer us that cooperation. And by the way, it's funny that yesterday at the session of the Executive Council of the OPCW, several allies of Great Britain called on us to cooperate with the British side. Well, probably they weren't. There wasn't enough time to brief them in advance about what to say. We have prepared a draft statement of the Security Council for the meeting. It's very simple. This is a litmus test of whether Great Britain and its allies are true to their word. If you, just as last time, if you bury this statement, which is a litmus test, if you kind of turn its substance inside out, its meaning, it will once again be further confirmation of your dirty games. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We didn't seek this meeting, but we take requests from the Council to meet very seriously, and I'm pleased to be able to update the Council on some developments, but I'm also pleased to be able to provide the intellectual clarity that our Russian colleague has called for, and I will stick in my statement to the facts. Following the poisoning on 4th of March in Salisbury of Sergei and Yulia Skripal, the UK has launched one of the most comprehensive and complex investigations into the use of a chemical weapon ever. It involves more than 250 police detectives. They are supported by a range of specialist experts and partners. They are trawling through more than 5,000 hours of CCTV. They are examining more than 1,300 seized exhibits, and they are interviewing more than 500 witnesses. Mr. President, in the UK, the police are independent of government, but if there are more details we can share with the Council as the investigation proceeds, we shall be very happy to do so. We all know why that investigation is underway. It's because a military-grade nerve agent was used in an attempt to kill civilians on British soil. It was carried out recklessly, and it was carried out without regard for public safety. It was a weapon of mass destruction. A British police officer was in a critical condition alongside the Skripals, and ordinary members of the public going about their daily business were put at risk. Mr. President, I am glad not only to be able to inform the Council that Yulia Skripal is able to communicate and is getting better, I can also clarify what the Russian ambassador said about consular access. We have received a request from the Russian consulate. We have conveyed it to Yulia Skripal, and we await her response. This is an obligation under international law that the British government takes very seriously, but there is also the question of Ms. Skripal's own wishes that need to be taken into account. Mr. President, the Russian ambassador had several points to make about the UK demands of Russia. As he outlined, on 12th of March, we asked the Russian government a very clear question. Russia refused to respond and said it considered the request null and void. It was indeed true, Mr. President, that we asked for a response within 24 hours to the question of how did a Russian-developed military-grade nerve agent come to be used on the streets of Salisbury, and did that mean that Russia had lost control of its CW stocks? We said that Russia should declare its Novichok program to the OPCW. We gave 24 hours, Mr. President, because this is a weapon of mass destruction. This is no ordinary poisoning and no ordinary attack, and in our view, the circumstances justified that tight deadline. But notwithstanding that, the Russians said to us the request was null and void. They did not say, please give us more time. They did not come to us and say, we would like to look into this with you. They rejected the very premise of the request. We have said, as the Russian ambassador quoted, that it is highly likely Russia carried out this assassination. The British government came to that conclusion because the positive identification by experts at Porton Down of the specific chemical used is a type of Novichok nerve agent. Porton Down, Mr. President, is an accredited laboratory under, and it conforms to, the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is allowed to conduct protective research. The second reason that helped us come to our conclusion was the knowledge that Russia has produced this nerve agent within the 10 years and remains capable of doing so. And as the Prime Minister made clear in the British Parliament, we know that the Russian state has investigated ways of assassination through the use of nerve agents. The third reason is Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and I don't want to detain the Council, Mr. President, by going through a long list, but I can provide examples if anyone would like to hear them. And we also made our own assessment that Russia views defectors as suitable targets for assassination, and indeed there are public statements from Russian leaders to that effect. I'd like, if I may, Mr. President, just to say something about the use of the phrase highly likely. We use this phrase because under the British system, only a court can finally determine culpability. So the use of the phrase highly likely is a reflection of our judicial process and should not be construed as casting doubt whatsoever on the likelihood of Russia being responsible. I would also like to take this opportunity to address the Russian ambassador's comment about Porton Down contradicting the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. There was no contradiction. The Foreign Secretary was making clear that Porton Down were sure the nerve agent was a Novichok, a point that they have subsequently reinforced. He goes on in the same interview to make clear why, based on that information, additional intelligence, and as I said, the lack of alternative explanation from the Russians, we have reached the conclusion we have. What the Foreign Secretary said then, what Porton Down have said recently, is fully consistent with what we have said throughout. In contrast, Mr. President, we have had innumerable theories from the Russians. I think we have counted some 24 in all. On the 21st of March, for example, the Russian Foreign Ministry said they believe terrorists did it. On the 14th of March, Mr. Lavrov said the British response was aimed at distracting from Brexit. Mr. President, the use of chemical weapons on any country's territory is far too serious for these theories to hold water. The Chemical Weapons Convention, which came into force 21 years ago, is clear in Article 7 that states should adopt legislation criminalising activity prohibited under the Convention. That's why the UK is conducting a full investigation of the incident, including under our own Chemical Weapons Act. Because of this, we have, in addition to the UK criminal investigation, invited the OPCW, the relevant international body, to assist in verifying our analysis, and this is on the basis of Article 8 of the Chemical Weapons Convention. This mandates the Technical Secretariat to provide technical assistance and technical evaluation to states parties. Everything we have done, Mr. President, has been consistent with the Convention on Chemical Weapons. And if I may say so, Mr. President, I won't take any lectures on morality or on our responsibilities under such international conventions from a country that, as this Council debated yesterday, has done so much to block the proper investigation of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. The UK's track record on that, Mr. President, speaks for itself. On 21 March, OPCW deployed a team to the UK to visit the locations where the victims were exposed to a toxic chemical. The DG briefed the OPCW Executive Committee yesterday on their actions. OPCW expert staff collected environmental samples from the scene and biomedical samples from the victims. OPCW has verified the chain of custody. These samples have been sent to several designated laboratories for testing. Analysis from these laboratories will now be returned to the OPCW and they will produce a report. Contrary to the Russian claims, Mr. President, the United Kingdom looks forward to sharing its findings once we have received that report. Yesterday, Russia tabled a resolution at the Executive Committee proposing a joint investigation. Mr. President, there are several ways to view this joint investigation. I think the metaphor that I find most apt is that of an arsonist turned firefighter. But in this particular instance, the arsonist wishes to investigate his own fire. Having failed to get a joint investigation, the resolution received only 6 out of 41 votes in favour, and without waiting for the outcome of OPCW testing, Russia has reverted to a familiar path of undermining the international institution involved. There is no other construction we can place on Mr. Lavrov's remarks today that Russia will accept results of the OPCW Salisbury poisoning investigation only if Russian experts participate in it. I am sorry, Mr. President, but that does not make it an independent investigation. If Russia insists on having its own experts, it seeks to move away from the Chemical Weapons Convention's stipulation, and it is setting a test that no independent investigation could credibly tolerate. This is part of a wider pattern, sadly, of irresponsible Russian behaviour. Russia discredited the joint investigation mechanism into use of chemical weapons in Syria. Members of the Council will be familiar with a pattern of aggression over the years in Georgia and Crimea. There has been the shooting down of MH17, and there has been a bungled attempt at a coup in Montenegro. And each time, Mr. President, these acts are accompanied by distortion and disinformation. The same sort of distortion and disinformation we saw yesterday in The Hague, in the Russian press conferences, and in the Security Council today. Mr. President, whilst we ourselves would not have called this meeting today, we hope to be able to brief the Council further once we receive the report from OPCW. We do believe that it is right that the Security Council remains seized of this flagrant use of chemical weapons, and it is that use which threatens international peace and security. The threats to the Chemical Weapons Convention from attacks in Syria, in Malaysia, and now the United Kingdom pose a very serious challenge to the non-proliferation regime that this Council and others have carefully constructed in response to the terrible events of the past. There is one country among us, Mr. President, Russia, which is playing fast and loose with our collective security and the international institutions that protect us. It is that reason, Mr. President, that leads people to accuse Russia and to take steps against her. It is not out of lack of friendship for the Russian people or lack of respect for Russia as a country. My own Foreign Secretary visited in the hope of establishing a more productive relationship with Foreign Minister Lavrov. But we cannot ignore what has happened in Salisbury. We cannot ignore Russia turning a blind eye to the use of chemical weapons in Syria and in Salisbury. And we cannot ignore the way that Russia seeks to undermine the international institutions which have kept us safe since the end of the Second World War. Mr. President, we believe that the UK's actions stand up to any scrutiny. We have acted in accordance with the CWC throughout and through the body charged for these purposes, the OPCW. We are happy to come to the Council at any time. We would be very willing to hold an open briefing at our mission here in New York if there are members of the UN who still have questions. We have nothing to hide, Mr. President, but I do fear that Russia might have something to fear. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, just a quick reminder, Mox News survives solely on your tips and contributions. It's easy to make a contribution or a tip or leave a tip at moxnews.com, or there are clickable links in the text body of this video. It should take the average person, most people, probably less than 2 minutes. Thanks very much for your time and your continued support. Stay cool, Wednesdays. This war is going to end. Till that day.